She walked into the store like any other customer, dressed in casual clothes, carrying nothing but her purse. To the employees, she was just another face. But within minutes, security began to follow her every move. Whispers turned into stares, and stares turned into accusations. Before long, 2 officers stormed in, handcuffs ready. They were convinced they had caught a shoplifter red-handed. What they didn't realize was the truth, that the woman they were about to humiliate wasn't just innocent. She was their commanding officer, an off-duty police captain. And when the truth came out, the fallout shook the department to its core. Her name was Captain Denise Carter, a veteran officer with nearly 20 years on the force. She had worked her way up from rookie patrol shifts to commanding entire precinct operations, respected by her colleagues known in the community, and dedicated to protecting people from the very kind of injustice she was about to face. Denise was the kind of officer who carried her badge with pride and with weight. But on this particular Saturday afternoon, the badge was tucked away in her purse, invisible to the world. She wasn't on duty. She was just a woman running errands after a long week, dressed in a casual navy sweatshirt, jeans, and sneakers. The store itself was nothing unusual. A mid-sized retail chain sitting at the edge of a suburban strip mall, the kind of place where weekend crowds shuffled between grocery aisles and seasonal sales bins. Families with children pushed carts. Teenagers browsed the electronics section. Nothing about the day suggested conflict until Denise noticed the eyes. Subtle at first, but there. An employee trailing her down the aisle a little too closely, pausing when she paused, pretending to restock items. The low hum of whispers from 2 clerks near the registers. She felt the scrutiny before she even had a reason to suspect why. Denise Carter wasn't unfamiliar with bias. As a black woman in law enforcement, she had confronted it both outside and inside the badge. She had coached younger officers on recognizing it, had mediated community forums about it, had lived it. But even with all that experience, nothing quite prepared her for being treated not as a professional, not as a customer, but as a suspect in her own neighborhood store. It started with the store manager's subtle signal, a nod toward security when she placed a few items in her basket. The security guard, eager and untrained, began circling the aisles with a radio clipped to his belt. Denise could hear the faint static bursts as he spoke into it. Minutes later, 2 local patrol officers arrived. Their cruiser idled outside, lights off, as if to downplay their presence. But their body language as they entered told the real story. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here for an arrest. At that moment, Denise Carter was not Captain Carter. She was just a woman in plain clothes, surrounded by assumptions. And while she continued to shop, unaware of the narrative being built around her, the officers were already exchanging looks, already convinced they had their criminal. They had no idea that the woman they were closing in on carried more authority than either of them had in their entire careers. Denise Carter moved through the aisles with practiced ease, selecting a few groceries and a bottle of water. To anyone else, it would have looked like the most ordinary Saturday routine. But to the store employees, whose suspicions had already been stoked, each movement was exaggerated through the lens of bias. She lingered too long at a shelf. She shifted her purse on her shoulder. She checked her phone while comparing prices. All of it became fuel for a false narrative that she was concealing items, that she was acting suspicious, that she was guilty before she had even reached the register. The whispers intensified. The guard's radio crackled again. This time Denise heard it clearly. "She's by aisle 7 now. Looks like she's stuffing something." She froze for just a moment. Stuffing something? She glanced around, half expecting to see another customer who might have matched the description. But no, there were no other shoppers nearby. She was the only one in the aisle. And suddenly she realized they were talking about her. Denise exhaled slowly, reminding herself to remain calm. She wasn't just any customer. She was a police captain. She had been on the other side of these calls before. She knew how quickly a misunderstanding or a prejudice could spiral out of control. She didn't want to escalate. She just wanted to pay for her items and leave, but she wouldn't be given that chance. As she made her way toward the front registers, Two uniformed officers entered the store. They were young, eager, the kind of patrolmen who walked with quick steps and an air of assumed authority. Their presence shifted the energy of the store immediately. Customers turned their heads. Conversations quieted. The manager pointed discreetly toward Denise. The officers approached her without hesitation. "Ma'am." "We're going to need to speak with you," one of them said. His voice clipped, authoritative. Denise looked at them calmly. "Is there a problem?" The second officer's eyes narrowed. "We've received reports of suspected shoplifting. We're going to need you to come with us." The words hit like a slap. Shoplifting, reports. She could feel the eyes of strangers burning into her, their assumptions clicking neatly into place. A black woman accused and uniformed men moving in. The stereotype was so predictable, so tired, and yet here it was, unfolding around her as if scripted. Denise straightened her shoulders. "I haven't stolen anything," she said firmly. "You can check my basket." "You can check me." But the officers weren't listening. One reached for her arm. The gesture was not violent, but it was definitive, the presumption of guilt manifest in a single motion. "Please, don't make this harder than it has to be," he said. Denise's heart pounded. Not from guilt, but from anger. She knew this playbook. She had seen people railroaded by it before. And the most painful part was that she had spent years trying to change the very culture that allowed this kind of rush to judgment. "Ma'am, step to the side," the first officer ordered. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Shoppers stood frozen at their carts. Cell phones began to appear, their cameras glowing faintly red as record buttons were pressed. Denise felt the humiliation rising, the heat of judgment radiating from every angle. She tried one more time, her voice steady but edged with steel. "I am telling you, I have not stolen anything. You are making a mistake." But the mistake was already in motion. The officer clipped a handcuff around her left wrist, ignoring her protest, pulling her other arm behind her back. The cold metal snapped shut with finality. Gasps rippled through the bystanders. A child whispered to his mother. What did she do? The mother hushed him, eyes wide. Denise Carter, police captain, decorated officer, mentor, and community leader, now stood in the middle of a store with her hands restrained like a common criminal. And all because two officers, a security guard, and a manager chose to see what they wanted to see instead of the truth. The humiliation was complete. But the story wasn't over, because the officers hadn't yet searched her purse. They hadn't yet seen the item inside that would unravel their entire case. They hadn't yet realized that the woman they were dragging toward the exit wasn't just any suspect. She was the very authority they claimed to serve. The fluorescent lights of the store cast a harsh glare as Captain Denise Carter was marched toward the entrance. The officers flanked her on either side, their hands firm on her arms, their posture rigid with self-assuredness. To them, this was a routine bust and open and shut case. To the onlookers, it was the spectacle of justice in action, or at least what they thought was justice. And to Denise, it was an indignity that cut deeper than the steel of the cuffs. Her mind raced. Should she say something now? Should she reveal who she was? Or should she wait, let them walk themselves fully into the pit they had dug? The sting of humiliation pushed her toward silence. Let them finish what they started. Let the full weight of their mistake crash down on them all, at once. At the exit, the manager stood waiting, his arms crossed smugly, his chest puffed up as though he had accomplished something. He nodded toward the officers as if giving his approval. Good job, gentlemen, he muttered. Knew she was trouble. The words made Denise's jaw tighten. She bit back the retort that burned in her throat. Not yet. The officers paused just beyond the sliding glass doors. One of them reached for her purse. We'll check her bag before we take her downtown, he said. Downtown. The word landed heavy. She could picture the process, the fingerprinting, the booking photos, the mugshot plastered into a system she herself commanded. The thought was absurd, but it was also dangerously close to becoming reality. One of the officers unzipped her purse, rifling through it carelessly. Receipts, keys, her wallet. And then his hand froze. Inside was a small leather case, black and worn from years of use. He pulled it out slowly, flipping it open with a practiced motion. What he saw made the color drain from his face. A gold badge. Shining, official, undeniable. Captain Denise Carter. The silence that followed was louder than any siren. The officer's eyes darted from the badge to her face, then back again, as though his brain couldn't reconcile the reality staring him in the face. His partner leaned over, reading the inscription, and his expression collapsed into shock. Denise lifted her chin, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a blade. "I am Captain Carter. I outrank both of you. And you just cuffed your commanding officer in front of an entire store full of witnesses." The murmurs began immediately. Customers shifted uncomfortably, phones rose higher, recording every detail. The smug expression on the manager's face melted into horror. The officers stammered, their hands trembling as they scrambled to undo the cuffs. Captain, we didn't know." Denise's voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of authority. "No, you didn't ask questions. You didn't investigate. You didn't even give me the basic respect you'd afford any other citizen. You assumed. You profiled. And now you've humiliated your own department." The cuffs clattered to the floor as they were hastily removed. Denise rubbed her wrists, the red marks already forming against her skin. She looked each officer in the eye, forcing them to see not just her, but the mistake they had made. The crowd was no longer silent. Whispers turned to exclamations. Someone near the front said, "She's a cop?" Another added, "They cuffed their own captain?" The buzz of disbelief grew louder, the kind of collective outrage that couldn't be contained. Denise turned to the bystanders, her voice steady. "You all saw what happened here. This is what bias looks like. This is what happens when assumptions replace facts." The manager stuttered, stepping forward. I was only trying to protect the store." Her eyes snapped to him, cold and unwavering. "No, you were trying to protect your prejudice. And now you've exposed it for everyone to see." The two officers looked as though the ground had opened beneath them. Their confidence shattered, replaced with the dawning horror of what their careers might now face. Denise straightened, her composure returning in full. The balance of power had shifted completely. She was no longer the humiliated woman in handcuffs. She was the captain, the leader, the embodiment of everything they had underestimated. And in that moment, the lesson was carved into stone. Assumptions carry consequences. The officers stood frozen, their silence and admission louder than any apology. The store manager looked as though he wanted to vanish. And the crowd, phones still raised, captured it all: the humiliation, the reversal, the undeniable truth. What began as an attempted arrest had flipped into a moment of reckoning, one that none of them would soon forget. The ride home that evening was unlike any drive Captain Denise Carter had ever made. She wasn't in a patrol car, nor was she in her office reviewing reports. She was in her own vehicle, the hum of the engine filling the silence, her wrists still aching faintly where the handcuffs had pressed into her skin. The echoes of the store lingered in her mind: whispers, gasps, the unmistakable humiliation of being dragged through aisles as if she were guilty. But more than that, she remembered the stunned silence when her badge was revealed, the look of pure disbelief on the officers' faces, and the shock rippling through the crowd. News travels fast, especially when cameras are involved. By the time Denise walked through her front door, videos of the incident were already spreading across social media. Captions varied: "Cops arrest their own captain," "Shoplifting accusation backfires," "Bias exposed in aisle 7. Each clip captured the same core truth. Two officers, a manager and a security guard, had let prejudice blind them. And in doing so, had not only embarrassed themselves, but cast a shadow over the entire department. The following Monday morning, Denise entered headquarters not as a victim, but as a commanding officer prepared to face the aftermath. The chief was already waiting in his office, arms folded, expression heavy with frustration. "Denise," he said, motioning for her to sit, "I've seen the footage." "Everyone has." She sat without hesitation, meeting his eyes. "Then you know what happened." He nodded grimly. I do, and now the city knows too. We're looking at disciplinary reviews for both officers. The manager's statement contradicts what the footage shows. And the public? Well, the public is demanding answers. For Denise, the situation was bittersweet. On one hand, accountability was finally being discussed. On the other, it had taken her own humiliation, her own rights being trampled, for the issue to reach the spotlight. The officers were suspended pending investigation. Their arrogance on that day had melted into public apologies, each word carefully crafted by union lawyers, each phrase trying to salvage careers already hanging by a thread. The store manager resigned under pressure after protests erupted outside the very strip mall where the incident had occurred. Signs held by community members read, "Shopping while black is not a crime," and "Justice for Captain Carter." Denise, meanwhile, became an unwilling symbol of a broader truth. News stations wanted interviews. Activist groups reached out. Citizens she had never met stopped her in the street, offering words of support and outrage in equal measure. For many, the image of a police captain respected, decorated, innocent being treated as a criminal for nothing more than her appearance, was proof of what they had been saying all along. Bias doesn't discriminate based on titles or accomplishments. It finds you wherever it can. But beyond the headlines, beyond the viral videos, the real impact was more personal. Denise sat with her fellow officers during roll call later that week, her eyes scanning the room. Some looked down, ashamed. Others avoided her gaze altogether. A few, however, looked directly at her with respect, their expressions silently acknowledging the lesson burned into that day. No one is above being profiled, not even their own captain. When she finally addressed the department, her voice carried the calm authority of a leader who had endured and emerged stronger. "What happened to me," she said, "was not just about me. It was about every single person who has ever been judged without cause, accused without evidence, and humiliated without truth. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And if we, those who wear this badge, cannot recognize the danger in that, then we are failing the very people we swore to protect." The room was silent. No rebuttals. No excuses. Just the heavy truth settling in. The fallout didn't stop there. The city launched mandatory retraining programs for officers, emphasizing implicit bias, procedural fairness, and community respect. It was, in many ways, damage control. But for Denise, it was at least a start. Policies could be rewritten. Trainings could be scheduled. Yet she knew the deeper change required something more: the willingness of individuals to confront their own assumptions, to question their reflexes, to treat every citizen with dignity before judgment. Weeks passed, but the incident remained etched into public memory. Every time Denise walked into a precinct or even into a store, she saw the recognition in people's eyes. She was no longer just Captain Carter. She was the captain who had been cuffed, the captain who had been profiled, the captain who had stood tall and revealed the truth. Late one evening, sitting on her porch, Denise reflected on the ordeal. The cicadas hummed in the warm night air. She thought about the officers, the manager, the bystanders. She thought about the faces of those who had recorded the moment, unknowingly turning her humiliation into evidence that would spark outrage, conversation, and hopefully change. And she thought about the broader lesson, one she hoped her story would carry long after the cameras turned away. Justice is not about uniforms or badges or authority. It is about fairness, about dignity, about refusing to let assumptions dictate reality. She took a slow breath, letting the night settle around her. Injustice had tried to write her story that day, but she had reclaimed the pen. And as she leaned back in her chair, she spoke words not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to herself, a vow she would carry forward. They thought they were arresting a shoplifter. What they really did was expose themselves, and I will never let them forget it.